Well, Dan, here we are, not a half a block above Grant Avenue in San Francisco's famous Chinatown. But this street, for my money, feels much more authentically Asian.
Well, Greg, that's because Waverly Place is not only in the heart of San Francisco's Chinatown, it is this neighborhood's heart and soul. Even though thousands of tourists walk through this area every single day, Chinatown is still a living, breathing, and thriving community. And along Waverly Place here, we see the best that this neighborhood has to offer. Now, it's often referred to as the street of the painted balconies. And if you look above, you'll see rows of colorfully painted wrought iron balconies on buildings that are adorned with wonderful Asian architectural motifs.
It really is a street that you can walk down and almost feel like you're in a foreign country.
Yeah, and that's because you'll also see a variety of herb shops, Chinese temples, and benevolent associations, also known as tongs. Now, these tongs have their roots going all the way back to the 1850s.
So the community really goes back that far. I'd always thought it sort of started up around the building of the Transcontinental Railway in the 1860s.
No, Greg. As a matter of fact, San Francisco's Chinatown is the oldest Asian neighborhood in North America. It began during the gold rush when young Chinese men came here, and initially they were actually accepted and even welcomed. But eventually, as their numbers grew dramatically, resentment began to build up, especially on the part of American workers who at the time were building labor unions and workers' rights, and they perceived the Chinese who were willing to work for very, very low wages as a threat to that effort.
So the racism at that time had economic underpinnings, really.
Oh, yeah. During the 1800s, the Chinese were not allowed to own property. They couldn't go to American hospitals. Their children couldn't attend American schools. They couldn't even testify in court.
Well, given all that, can you explain to me how Chinatown ended up being right in the heart of San Francisco?
For a period in the 1850s, San Francisco was growing very quickly towards Market Street, and a vacuum opened up along Grant Avenue that the Chinese quickly filled. Now, eventually, that nucleus grew to about 12 square blocks, but it was never allowed to grow larger than that for over 70 years.
So that, once again, those racial issues kind of kept it confined into this physical environment.
Exactly.
Now, I have to figure that back in the 1850s, the 1860s, this was a community largely made up of men.
Right. Most of the immigrants back then were young bachelors, and these bachelors living in a tightly encapsulated neighborhood like this were in an area that was obviously fertile for vice and crime. And in an 1880s survey in which they created a color-coded map, you could see that there were 26 opium dens here, 54 brothels, and dozens of gambling parlors.
Now, that doesn't sound at all like the Chinese community that I grew up next to as I was growing up in San Francisco in the 50s and 60s. What happened to change it from that den of iniquity to the happy family environment it became?
Well, like much of San Francisco, Chinatown changed after the 1906 earthquake and fire swept through and pretty much burned the entire neighborhood down. And the Chinatown that grew up on its ashes was a markedly different and more respectable place. The tongs and associations took the upper hand, and they started to develop the kinds of amenities, infrastructure to create a wonderful family neighborhood. So today, of course, there are hospitals here, there are schools, playgrounds. It's a wonderful neighborhood to bring your kids up in, to take them to civic events. There are all sorts of great things that this neighborhood today has to offer to people, whether they're visiting or whether they're living here.
Not to mention a lot of great restaurants. So Dan, now we're right in Portsmouth Square, which I've always associated, obviously, with Chinatown because it's right next to Chinatown. And yet you're telling me that this square plays a pivotal role in the very beginning history of San Francisco.
Portsmouth Square is the oldest public square in the city, and it's the birthplace of the gold rush.
Wait a minute, I thought the gold rush started about 100 miles away from here, up at the American River.
Well, you would be right. However, Greg, as you will soon learn, it's one thing to discover gold, but it's an entirely different thing to set off a gold rush. Let's go back to the year 1839. Now, Yerba Buena Village was situated on the shores of a beautiful sandy beach cove that went from Rincon Hill to Telegraph Hill and came all the way in almost to where Montgomery Street is today. The village was originally established as a trading post to facilitate trade between rancheros and ships that sailed through the Golden Gate from ports around the world. Now, in 1839, this little village only had about 200 residents. One of the first things they did, though, was to build an adobe customs house on the northeast corner of the square. If we fast forward to 1846, Yerba Buena's population has only grown to about 350 to 400 residents. But things would soon begin to change. And the first harbinger of that change occurred on July 9th, 1846. In the wee hours of the morning, led by Captain John B. Montgomery, the U.S. Navy sloop of war, the USS Portsmouth, quietly sailed over from Sausalito and dropped anchor in Yerba Buena Cove. 70 Marine soldiers and sailors marched up to the square here to the sound of fife and drums, and they raised the American flag on the flagpole, claiming San Francisco for the United States.
And they didn't meet with any resistance.
Well, it was a peaceful transition. Most residents were Americans or Europeans. As a matter of fact, afterwards, they all retired to Ridley's Bar for a round of beer and toasts. Now, the next year, in 1847, the village changes its name from Yerba Buena to San Francisco. Also in that year, they build the first public schoolhouse in all of California right here in Portsmouth Square. As a matter of fact, one of the supervisors of the building of that was Alexander Liedesdorf, one of the early African-American pioneers here in San Francisco. But change would even be greater the following year. Now, we all know that on the morning of January 24th, 1848, on the South Fork of the American River, a man named James Marshall was completing the construction of a lumber mill, and he was clearing out a channel he had built next to the river, and he looked through the cold Sierra snowmelt waters and saw a shiny glint of yellow metal. Well, right then and there, he ran down to his boss, John Sutter. The two of them locked themselves in a room. They tested it out, and sure enough, it was
Gold.
That's right, gold. But the gold rush didn't start right then. First of all, Sutter and Marshall wanted to keep the information themselves, and they made a private pact, which was probably the worst kept secret in history.
But this isn't when the gold rush really started.
No, imagine, there was no mass communications in those days. Also, there had been earlier discoveries of gold in California that hadn't amounted to much. So when rumors first started circulating about it, nobody paid much attention. So if we had to put an actual date on the beginning of the gold rush, it would be several months later on May 12, 1848, because it was on that date that a man by the name of Samuel Brannan came down to San Francisco with a bottle filled with gold dust, and he rode through the streets of San Francisco and walked across Portsmouth Square here, waving it over his head, yelling, "Gold, gold, gold from the American River." And that was finally when all of San Francisco caught gold fever. As a matter of fact, within a very short time, everyone in the whole town, including the mayor, had en masse run up to the mother lode country, beginning the world-famous gold rush. Sam Brannan stocked up his hardware store in Sacramento with picks and shovels and rockers and pans and all of the implements that one would need to go gold mining.
So his plan was to get rich selling those implements to the people who were trying to get rich with the gold rush.
That's right, because no single miner ever became wealthy mining during the gold rush. The people who were most successful were those visionaries and entrepreneurs who realized that there were going to be hundreds of thousands of people coming here, and that all of those people would need shelter and clothing and food and entertainment. And it was those people who supplied those things that did the best. And even today, we have companies in San Francisco that have roots going all the way back to San Francisco and the gold rush. I'm sure you can even name a few.
Oh, at least a few. You've got Levi Strauss, you've got Wells Fargo.
That's right. Ghirardelli Chocolate, Hills Brothers Coffee, all started here during the gold rush.
That's just phenomenal.
In 1849, over 700 ships came through the Golden Gate and dropped anchor in Yerba Buena Cove, and San Francisco grew at a breakneck speed. As a matter of fact, there was a period in 1849 when the population of San Francisco was doubling every 10 days. Buildings were thrown up chock-a-block all around the square. There was one lot here that in 1847 sold for $16.50. The same lot in 1848 sold for $6,000. And in 1849, the very same lot sold for $45,000.
That's incredible.
That's over a 2,000% increase in just 2 years.
Which should make everybody these days feel a little more sanguine about our pricing, huh?
It was pretty wild in those days.
Here we are walking up to the corner of Montgomery and Clay Street, right in the heart of downtown San Francisco. And you're telling me that 150 years ago, this was beachfront property.
If we were standing here 150 years ago, we'd be standing on the shores of Yerba Buena Cove. And it was at this exact spot that Captain John B. Montgomery landed in 1846. This is also a very important historic spot because we are standing next to a building that is a National Historic Landmark. And it's also a symbol of San Francisco's remarkable rebirth following the 1906 earthquake and fire. It was built in 1908 by the Bank of Italy, and it is one of San Francisco's finest examples of Beaux-Arts architecture. Now, Beaux-Arts is a style of architecture that was popular around the turn of the century, and it draws heavily on classical Greek and Roman themes. It is very ornamental and monumental. Let's take a look inside, because as impressive as the outside is, the inside looks even better. You know, Greg, the Bank of Italy actually opened in 1904, about a block away from here, and was founded by a man by the name of A.P. Giannini.
Of course, a very famous San Francisco name.
That's right. And Giannini had a vision. He wanted to revolutionize banking. You know, before he came along, banks were really kind of forbidding prison-like places that just catered to businesses and wealthy individuals. But Giannini really wanted to bring in the common person, you know, the butcher and the baker and the teacher and the nurse, people in those days who had never been in a bank before.
Now, this is where you get attributed that famous line of his, the bank for the little people.
That's right. He wanted the little guy to come in, so he opened his bank on Saturdays. You could deposit as little as $5 and open up an account. He made small loans. And so he was very quickly popular, and his bank, within just a couple of years, did very well. Just 2 years after the bank was founded, though, Greg, it was threatened by the 1906 earthquake and fire. The fire, of course, swept through this entire neighborhood, but before it reached here, Giannini managed to get to the bank in his horse and cart, loaded it up with all the money and the securities and the documents in the safe, and escaped to his home in San Mateo. Now, that allowed him to be the first bank to reopen after the fire. As a matter of fact, he set up a bank office outside with just a plank on 2 barrels in the Washington Street Pier. Now, he also then had a real vision of the rebirth of San Francisco after the fire. He commissioned architects to build this beautiful building we're standing in now. He didn't want just any bank. He wanted something really magnificent to show that this was once again going to be a world-class city. And this building is that result.
And this building, in fact, became that monument to our coming back from the earthquake and fire.
That's right. And you can see that he really spared no expense. Look at the beautiful Carrara marble walls, the gold coffered ceilings, the marble-colored cartouches on the capitals. It's really one of the most exquisite examples of turn-of-the-century interior architecture.
No, you wouldn't think it was a bank just walking into it.
No, and that's because he really wanted it to be inviting to people, but yet at the same time to feel very secure.
Well, speaking of security, I've always been fascinated by that safe door. It's such a magnificent piece of metal and machinery.
Yeah, isn't it incredible, all the gears and mechanisms inside that? You know, that door is over 15 inches thick and weighs 2,000 pounds.
So AP Giannini, by building that, was saying this is a safe place for your money.
And he put it right out in the lobby so that everybody could see it. As a matter of fact, he spent $45,000 on the safe alone, which is equivalent today to about $1 million.
Now, I got to ask you, is it true, the stories I've heard throughout my life, that AP Giannini, the president of this bank, actually had his own desk right here in this lobby to greet everybody who came into the bank?
That's right. You could talk to the president of the bank right there. And as a matter of fact, that's where he launched the first branch banking system in the United States.
Which obviously later became the Bank of America, right?
Right. And the Bank of America became the most successful commercial bank in the world, all because of AP Giannini's vision.
Another San Francisco first right here.
That's right.